Hi, I'm Artemis, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I wanted to show you my first full cosplay. We're doing a Harry Potter themed month at work, and I wanted to make a cosplay of a Hogwarts professor. So for this project, I'm mainly focusing on a Hogwarts robe and a wand. I decided to follow a DIY video on how to sew a Hogwarts robe, as I hadn't really used a sewing machine before. I found an instructional video by Fleece Fun, which I'll link in the description below. The video also included these free templates, as well as a step-by-step guide on how to get to the finished product. The template also tells you how much fabric you need, which is really handy because, well, I basically had no clue. After I made the cutouts, I basically threw them in a bag with all my fabrics, and I forgot about them for a few months as I had a lot of other stuff going on in my life, and it was just before Christmas. I also mentioned that I wanted to make a wand to go with this cosplay, and before I started making my wand, I did the wand test on HarryPotter.com. I thought it would be really fun to make the wand out of my actual wand wood, and as I got large for my wand wood, I went out and found a large branch. I also made a template to the length of my wand so that I could easily measure without going back and forth. As I started turning it in the lathe, it was really off center and I really just couldn't get it going right. So instead, I stripped the bark off and I tried to press it and leave it overnight. So this is the day after, and in hindsight I should probably have left it for way longer. This is because the branch was harvested from outside and still had a lot of moisture, so it should have just dried in that pressed position. Even though it still wasn't perfectly straight, I managed to get it into the lathe and centered enough to start working on. As you can see, it's not really perfect, but when I get the core out, it sort of makes a straight piece of wood. I kind of like this method because it really shows the grain of the wood when you sort of cut it back without it being completely centered. I started working on shaving it all down to a uniform straight shape before I started on the details. I usually go by eye and feel on the ones I've made so far, but for this one I had a small sketch with a rough idea of how I wanted it to turn out. I've really taken a liking to lathing wands, and I found the process quite fun, and I actually really enjoy the sanding part, which I hated as a kid in school. With a lathe, it's so much easier to get a good result, and it's so satisfying to get that silky smooth finish. When I'm happy with the shape, I'll start sanding it, and I'll of course start with a rough sandpaper and moving my way to a finer grit. After that, I'll finish it with the steel wool. The steel wool actually makes a world of difference, even better than a fine sandpaper. And this is how the wand's looking so far. As you can see, the grain really pops. After the lathing process, I sanded down the tip so it would be uniform. One lesson I learned on this was that I should have made a longer piece for the lathe to hold on to, because using my measuring template, I really was sort of pushing it with keeping the correct length on the wand while still not leaving any marks on it. So large is actually not an evergreen, even though it's a sort of pine tree, and that means it drops its needle during the winter. And in the spring, the needles will regrow, and they'll grow out from the little nodules that you can see on this large twig. So I figured, why not have some of these nodules on my wand? So I sketched out a rough pattern of where I wanted them to be, and then I dremeled a little indentation so that I could super glue each of these little nodules. I started using some small tweezers to sort of not get glue everywhere. They didn't really work out, so I ended up using my fingers instead and made a complete mess, but at least most of the nodules that I fastened to my wand ended up staying on there. And this is how it looked this far in the process. Then I applied some finishing oil, and after drying it actually looked quite nice. Okay, so back to the robe. I mentioned that I procrastinated all through December and through Christmas, so just after New Year's I figured I need to get this done, and I started working on my robe. This first piece is the back piece of the robe, and it was cut by folding the fabric in half and placing the longest edge of the template on the fold and cutting all the way around. This means that this back piece comes out in one big piece, so it doesn't have to be sewn together in the middle of the back. And it looks like this. The next piece to cut out was the hood of the robe, and this time I didn't use the folding technique so that I would get two separate pieces. Now this next piece was quite smart, because we're reusing the template for the back, and we're removing just a tiny bit of the template. But this time we cut the fold, so that it gives us two separate pieces that goes on the front of the robe. And this is what the individual pieces looked like. Next up were the sleeves, and this time we used the folding trick again. But to get the most out of our fabric, we have to rearrange the fold. This way we optimize our fabric usage and we can get two full sleeves out of our remaining fabric. And this is what one of the sleeves looks like. Next we're cutting out all the blue details, as I was making a Ravenclaw robe. The blue details are the inlays for the sleeves, the hood and the front of the robe. I started cutting out the sleeves and then reused the template for the second one. And this is what the inlays looks like. I moved on to the hood lining, and I used the same template as before, but I flipped it over so that I would get the most out of my fabric. Next up were these long strips of color, which are the details for the front of the robe. Following the instructional video, I started sewing these pieces together, and I have to say they were quite easy to follow. Something really smart that I wasn't really aware of with sewing, since I hadn't really worked with anything like this before, is that you could sew it inside out, meaning that when you flip it, it looks like a really neat seam, although you might not be the best at using a sewing machine. When both sleeves were sewn on, I started on the hood, and I'm not sewing all the way around, just where I've indicated here. And I'm doing the same with the inlay. This bit was kind of hard, but it was also clearly explained in the video. So with that all done, we have to fasten these two pieces together. This part I would have preferred to have a bit more clear instructions, so it did take me some trial and error, but I did get it eventually. So the point here was to fasten these two pieces together so that you could later turn them inside out and stuff the blue lining inside the black hood. But it was sort of both a mental workout and, as I said, I would have preferred a bit clearer instruction on this part. So I sewed them both together, and after I did this, you had to turn them inside out. And after you turn both of them inside out and make sure that the points are properly turned out, and you stuff the blue lining into the black hood. And a tip for this was actually to use a chopstick or something pointy but not sharp to sort of get them lined up right at the point. And this is how it looks afterwards. So basically the hood's done and ready to fasten to the rest of the robe, which I'm doing here. This part was more straightforward to follow. After sewing on the hood, I had to start preparing the details for the front of the robe. And I had to fold the edge in on itself and use a different kind of stitch, I'm not quite sure why, but to make a nice edge. So when you sew it onto the rest of your robe, there will be no rough edges showing. After I completed prepping the lining, I sewed it onto the front of the robe. And again, you used the trick of sewing it on the wrong side out, meaning that you could just fold it back in on itself inside the robe, and that you would then get this nice edge. For the hem of the robe, I used the same technique as with the details for the front. I folded the edge in on itself and sewed it so that it would be uniform and not show any rough edges. And even though we used the inside out trick for the lining, I still felt that they were a bit flappy, so I just went back and forth on 3 different areas, a few stitches each, and sort of fastened it so it would stay more in place. Moving on to the sleeve inlays, again we're using the inside out technique. So we thread the lining on the outside and then we sew around the front of the sleeve. After we've done this, we turn the whole thing inside out. That way we're left with a nice edge for the sleeve inlay. One of my colleagues made me this patch using our embroidery machine, and it's the house crest for Ravenclaw from the Hogwarts Legacy game. Using a special glue, I ironed it on the front of the robe. Alright, so this is the final cosplay and the finished outfit. I'm quite happy with it. I bought a plain blue shirt, and then I bought this vest off of Amazon. And I also bought these pins or trinkets and a pocket watch just to give it some character. In addition, what I haven't filmed is that I've added a wand pocket. Because I noticed that when I started using this, I would misplace my wand all the time because this didn't have any pockets. So I figured a wand pocket would be a good way to go about it. So I figured I'd show you the wand pocket as well. One thing that you might notice with this is that it's not actually sewn into the robe the entire way. And that's because I used a fabric glue strip to keep it all together. I ran into a few problems with this, however, so just to keep the corners in place, I just hand stitched a few stitches in the corners, and also at the bottom here I had to stitch all the way across. That was because of my second problem, which was that the tip of my wand would actually get stuck inside the glue, so I wouldn't be able to get it out. And therefore I sewed these stitches so it wouldn't get stuck. You probably noticed that the wand doesn't have the same finish as it did earlier in the video. That's because there were two things that didn't settle quite right with me. The first was the color, and I found it to be a bit too light or pale. Therefore I decided to paint it with Warhammer contrast paint, so that I would get a transparent coat which would still show the wood grain underneath. Secondly, there were these nodules. The placement were just a bit too random. So I rearranged them in more of a cluster pattern and a more defined spiral all around the wand. After all the modifications were complete, I finished it with spray varnish. In addition to the vest and shirt, I put on some nice trousers and some smart looking shoes. For this cosplay, I took a great deal of inspiration from the fashion in the Fantastic Beasts franchise, which happens in the 1930s. All in all, this was a fun project, and it definitely made me want to work more with projects like this. Please subscribe to follow my journey, where I explore if creativity can be trained. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.